So my talk today is Uneven Recovery, exploring the role of remittances in post-Yolanda recovery, and also known as Haiyan, Typhoon Haiyan. So when I started my PhD, there was a big just excitement about remittances, remittance euphoria. You know, over the last 20 years, remittance inflows to developing countries has grown eightfold, from 56 billion to 432 billion. So that's an incredible increase, and it's gotten a lot of attention from policymakers. We've gotten lots of forums and lots of reports and academic research on remittances. You've got countries that are very interested in how they can leverage remittances. You've got Donald Trump, who says that the Mexican remittances will pay for the wall. So remittances are getting a lot of attention, right? And as well, it's shown to be more than foreign aid, as well as foreign direct investment. So there's a lot of excitement about remittances, and at the same time, at the start of my PhD, Typhoon Haiyan struck, one of the strongest typhoons to ever make landfall. The Philippines is a disaster-prone country. About 20 typhoons come through a year, and about 6 to 7 on an average make landfall, but this was one of the most devastating ones. Tacloban city, where my research is based, a lot of people say it was completely destroyed. These are the ships that came into the land and killed many people. It was estimated about 6,000 officially died, but locals are saying it could be 10, it could be 20. The numbers are higher, or a lot of people were unreported. So, but it was a mass devastation. And it drew a lot of attention globally. And of course, a number of people that were displaced was actually larger than Katrina and the Asian tsunami combined. So the magnitude of Yolanda was immense. So these two things came together for my PhD to look at remittances and natural disasters. And what really struck me was this quote from a report in the Philippines Humanitarian Country Team. Only 9 months after Typhoon Haiyan, self-recovery efforts by affected communities combined with a scaling up of government-led interventions and effective national and international humanitarian efforts have led to a significant reduction in the level of humanitarian need, and many sectors are already well in the recovery phase of the ground. I looked at the other reports, and they attributed, help from networks, they attributed help from remittances, they attributed a lot to self-recovery. So I was very interested in this concept of self-recovery and networks providing assistance to you, as opposed to perhaps NGOs or the government. And this is where my research starts. So my research question is, how does the type of support network and how they interact facilitate post-disaster recovery? And I've got a variety of sub-questions, and this is what I'll explore today, but I'll just go through them briefly. So I'm looking at the type of networks. So how does the type of networks the household have affect post-disaster recovery? Mainly, I'm looking at the local network that they have and the migrant network that they would have. The size of the network, how does the size of the network the household have affect post-disaster recovery? The nature of networks, and this is where I'm looking at social capital, and I'm looking at bonding, bridging, and linking ties, which I'll get into later, but the different ties and the nature of the network that the household has. The timing of support, that's one of the big things, one of the gaps in the literature is understanding how the different timing of support affects post-disaster recovery. The earlier work that Dr. Ladie did looked at short-term and long-term coping mechanisms in recovery, so it touched a bit on timing, and I get more specific into that. And then the type of support, so whether it's financial or non-financial support that is provided. So I try to look at a more comprehensive, holistic idea of recovery and bring it together. So in a disaster, you would have the locals who are the most affected as well, but they're often the first responders. They're the people that do the search and rescue. They're the people that are helping each other evacuate, prepare, as well as recover right after Yolanda. And the interesting thing about the local network is that, they're the first to respond, but they're also affected. So their capacity to help is limited despite their closeness. And then you have the migrant network. So people who are from farther away, your family members, who are not affected by the disaster physically, who are very well connected to you, and they're farther away, so they have access to resources that they can send. So I'm trying to look at how the two interact and help the household in the recovery process. And now I'll go over a bit of the lit review quickly on remittances and disaster. So a lot of literature says that people who receive remittances, they recover faster, they recover stronger, and they recover better. I'm generalizing. But what I found is that they could recover faster depending on the relationship they have with the migrant, right? Not everybody has a very close relationship where they get regular remittances of a substantial amount. Oftentimes they get a Christmas box, or they'll get money during birthdays or during emergencies. So we have to really get into the actual type of relationship and the ties that the household has. Just because they have access to remittances or a migrant network does not necessarily mean that they're able to mobilize that network and get help from it. Stronger, there's the idea that households who have remittances, access remittances, they are better prepared because their houses are usually concrete, and I do find support for that. It's also because sometimes they're middle class. So people who have access to the labor market abroad may also be middle class, and therefore a combination of things come together for them to have perhaps a concrete house or a stronger house. But they still get affected. So in Typhoon Haiyan, Yolanda, they were still, the roofs were blown off and their houses were washed out, the water came up, so they were also affected as well. So stronger can also be challenged. And then just better. The idea that they have these remittances, things are faster, they can build back stronger, and they're more prepared for the next disaster. And that's not, that's not usually the case, depending on the type of relationship that they have, the access to remittances they have, and how their migrant network interacts with their local network. And this is what I try to contribute. So the theory I'm using is a network theory of social capital, and defines social capital as resources embedded in one social network, resources that can be accessed or mobilized through ties in the networks. Are many of you familiar with the social capital? No? A little bit? Okay. I guess the really basic idea is, it's not what you know, it's who you know. So there's value and there's resources in your network that can be accessed, especially during times of a crisis. So I'll break down the different ties. So in the literature, there's bonding, bridging, and linking ties. So bonding ties are those who are very close to you, they're very closely connected to you. They could be your immediate family, they could be your best friend, really close friends, or your neighbors, people that you share a similar background to you, that you feel very comfortable with, and who might help you during times of need, or you might help them. It's a reciprocal relationship. Bridging tie could be somebody that is an extra local, that can give you access to extra local networks, maybe people that you would meet at a university or at a club or that's part of your basketball team. And then linking ties is somebody who you interact with across power or authority gradients. So like a politician or a professor, somebody who holds more power than you, and by having that link, you can hopefully access that power as well. So these are the three very basic social capital or links, and I'm sure many of you have that in your lives as well, and you can start to think of those people who you are bonding, or bridging, or linking to. So my case study is Tacloban City. It's in Leyte in the Philippines. This is a map of the storm surge that took place. And you can see it was very devastating, and the storm surge was very high. And many people did not know what a storm surge was. And that was the big difficulty around that time, is that people understood a big wave. They understood tsunami, but they did not necessarily understand a storm surge. And it makes sense, because how do you try to explain a storm surge when people know the other terms, but also you cannot say tsunami because it's not a tsunami. So I think the people on the ground, the politicians or the NGOs or the people in the weather network, they had a difficult time trying to communicate the severity of the issue, because of the scientific terminology. And I guess they feel responsible because they can't say tsunami because it's not a tsunami, because then they're misinforming. So I can tell there was a lot of tension about what to do about that in terms of communicating. In my research, what I found was very helpful was an analogy. So people who did evacuate would hear things like, it's so strong it can move a big bulldozer, right? It's, the typhoon is so strong that it would break all your windows. So those seemed like more effective than just saying it's a Category 5, or it's just saying that it's a big typhoon. Especially with people who might have survived past typhoons. It was very common for them to say that, I didn't evacuate because I've survived typhoons. So I didn't think that this was going to be anything different. So I guess it goes back to Bangkok's culture of disasters in the Philippines, that there's so many disasters that they've built their lives around disasters, or are very adaptable and resilient as a result. But with Typhoon Haiyan being so strong, a lot of those things could not come into play to assist them. So my methodology. So I did short surveys using systematic random sampling in the 3 communities to collect data on the households to use for selecting respondents. So I did 508 surveys, or me and my team, so that's just me, a bunch of us. And it's because we didn't have any census data on the community, so we weren't able to access that information. And we didn't feel comfortable going through NGO or the barangay or the village captain because of the politics that might be involved, so we thought that we would go and do the surveys, short surveys ourselves. And a lot of the data that I analyze is from the short survey, as opposed to the later part, because it's too rich, and you'll see it soon. After I completed the short surveys, I was able to categorize them based on class, access to migrant or OFW, overseas Filipino worker, or a number of adults in the household. So that's what I was trying to control for. And then I did 72 interviews and sociograms, or what I called recovery grams, which again I will explain to you later. So the question is, how do you try to get an understanding of their social capital or their ties, right? A lot of social capital research uses proxies. So they would just ask people, how many funerals did you go to this year? How many weddings did you go to this year? Or like, did you vote? And how many organizations that you're a part of. But what I found in the Philippines is, due to vote buying, then voting cannot be used as a proxy, and the communities are actually quite tight knit. So I didn't think that weddings or funerals could be really that helpful in deciding the specific household's social capital, especially when a funeral takes place. It's common for someone to go around and collect funds towards that funeral. So these are already things that the community is quite involved in. And then when I try to look at organizations, in Tacloban at least, in the urban areas, there were organizations, but many of the people in these households, they would say they're too busy. They're just too busy to join these associations. So it's very different than Putnam's America, where he talks about bowling alleys and bird watching clubs and those kind of things. So that didn't exist. So I had to find a different way to try to capture their social capital, to try to capture their ties and understand their story of recovery. So I thought I would do that through a sociogram. So a sociogram is more a sociological method where you try to get people to list down their ties and how close they are to you and what groups they belong in. So in the end, you actually get a good idea of your social network, who is important to you, who helps you with what, and how you're connected, or perhaps any bridging or linking ties that you might have. Often it's actually used for people that are looking for jobs. So then you actually have a good idea of how many networks you're attached to, or what networks you need to be attached to. So in this case, we have the very close ties, the somewhat close ties, and the organizational assistance. So what would happen is that I would present this, and these are Post-its. So I try to be more interactive, because of course when you just ask people, who helped you? You might think of 3-4 people that helped you, and then that's it. Like it's the end, right? So by having them write down the names, by having it be very physical, then the people are encouraged to continue thinking. And once they write down one person's name, like Anna, oh, you know what? Anna's sister also helped me, or Anna's brother. And then you start actually having more names as opposed to, again, just off the top of your head. And then after that is done, the second thing that I learned is that it's very difficult to ask people about their money. So you cannot, one of the first trips that I went to, I'd ask them, do you get remittances? And of course, they're reluctant, because who are you? Why do you care about the money that I get? So after some trial and error, and after realizing, yeah, of course, like I don't want to be in that position either. I don't want to be in that position of where I'm asking you about your money or your financial situation when you don't want to reveal. So I wanted a slower process where they give consent regarding the information that they pass to me. And it's a very respectful exchange, right? So if they don't want to tell me, then they don't have to tell me, and I think that's perfect. But if they do, then they have a means to do it. So I do it through stickers. So they would then, after they write a name of an individual, perhaps a sister in Dubai, or just their mom that lives next door, Then I ask them, so what type of assistance do they provide you? And a red dot would mean that they gave you financial assistance. So then they just start, oh yeah, like this person helped me, and that person helped me, and this NGO helped me. And then green dot is non-financial. So we actually start with the non-financial first. So then they get very used to sharing about what they received, the rice that they got, or the time that a relief came and the neighbor ran over to tell them that the relief came, etc. So then it gets very colorful. And then we have a star for the migrant or the extra local Thai. So even somebody in Samar would count as, because then they would be not as affected by Typhoon Haiyan or Manila. So then they would put a star. So then next thing you know, this is very it's very decorated, and it's a good way to get them to participate and also take control over the method, because we find that, of course, during the interview process, you try very hard to be friendly and engaging and making a conversation. But at the end of the day, you're still dictating the conversation. You're presenting the questions, and then they're providing answers. Even if it's semi-structured, there's still that dynamic. But once you turn things around and you let them take control, a lot of things come out, and they feel more comfortable, because again, they know that they control how much they tell you and how much they don't tell you. So I found that experience to be really helpful in terms of building trust and getting information. I'll show you the next thing. So this is the recovery gram. So it's a little overwhelming at first, but basically, if you think about it, there are two main things happening. Time, like a clock. So every quarter, every slice of the pizza is 6 months, up to 3 years. And then the different rings is the level of helpfulness someone's assistance was to you. And so you would put your household in the middle. And then you would start to take these ties. So then I would be like, okay, so what did your sister in Dubai, when did she assist you? Oh, she assisted me right away. So they would take the tie and they would put it here, right? And then they would start to tell us about what happened, and then we'd be like, okay, so did she provide you with further assistance later on? And they might say, actually no, because she has her own family, so she was only able to give us 10,000 pesos right after Yolanda, so we just leave it at that. And then they'll still just continue to do this, and then they move it around, and next thing you know, the whole thing is filled. And also, it's regarding the organizations. It was very common for the NGOs to help for a year, maybe up to a year and a half, and then there wouldn't be that much assistance, and that's because the emergency period is over. However, these ties also represent organizational links or linking ties, so perhaps the barangay captain or NGO staff or other people, or even religious leaders that might have access to resources, and they can put it all around. So, okay, I'll give you lots of examples to see. So that is the method generally. Do you have any questions before I move on? Yeah.
Yes. I like this because this is really case study which shows the boundary with the time, 3 years after.
Yeah.
Just a small, just wanted to ask you, when you ask respondent saying that they received or they join this cash for work, where do you put that?
That would be organization, because they get the cash for work through the organization. But one thing I do distinguish.
Is that considered as money or?
It's considered money. It's considered as money. Yeah. One thing I do distinguish is that organizations that came and just helped you once, like gave you a bag of rice or just gave you money once, I count them as an organizational type, but I don't count them as linking capital, because you don't actually have a relationship with them. But what's very interesting is that some people are quite clever and they develop a relationship with the NGO. So that's in their community. So then they can further get assistance, or they can get, I guess, quicker information about when the distribution is and whatnot. So the organizational ties can become linking ties with these international NGOs. But often the international NGOs that just come, they don't know you, so I wouldn't count them as linking social capital. Any other questions? Yes?
How would you do if remittances is used as a strategy? Let's say someone is affected, is using some link overseas to travel, work overseas for 1 year, bring back remittances. Would you count that as social capital and remittances? Would you be able to map it here?
Yes. So the other thing, I'll start showing you examples and you'll see. Because the other thing is that for when we present it like this, it will just look like, so it gets started, I'm just showing you now because the finished products are very overwhelming, so I don't want you to get, because there's lots of color and stuff. So for example, it would just, this would just be an example of what one sociogram would look like. But as we talk to them, right, they reveal other information, like who helps them for the whole 3 years, who helps them just once. So then we can start drawing arrows, right? And we can also we ask questions about reciprocity. So who did you help, right? These people that helped you, did you actually help them back, right? Is there a reason why you only got remittances once and it was a smaller amount? Is it because you don't communicate with that aunt or that cousin, so they only gave you that one-shot assistance because of what they saw on TV? Or with your neighbors, right? Are these neighbors that helped you the most? Or do you lend them money sometimes? Do you share food? So next thing you know, this ended up being very colorful and crowded, but then you get a more complete idea of their recovery and the actual relationships they have. And the good thing about this is, although this looks messy and it's colorful, with codes and everything, I can record everything very succinctly, so that helps with my own data analysis. So I'll just start showing you examples and
Did you conduct this activity as part of one-on-one interview or as part of group activities?
It's one-on-one. It's with the household. So sometimes there's one, or sometimes there's just the mom, and sometimes it's the mom and dad, and yeah. So I'll just show you quickly how I record the data. Yeah. So I have it on a sheet, and you would have the name, the Thai, where they work, where they live, for financial, non-financial assistance, what that was, when it was given, how much, the financial, and that's for non-financial, and then financial, and then if you help them back, and then what the score is on the 1 to 4 in terms of how helpful they are. Yeah. So it's great because I find that because they're so much more comfortable, right, doing an activity like this, I can still record data without going through it robotically. Because I tried that the first time and it did not go over well. Nobody liked it. So this worked out well. So I'll start showing you examples. So this would be non-migrant lower class. So you see there are a couple of pink ties. The green ties are the NGOs, and then the yellow ties are the somewhat close ties. So they don't have that many ties, and I define a small network as 13 or less, and a large network is 13 plus. So you can see the rest of the graph is pretty sparse, right? So they get that help right away, but then they don't get much assistance, and a lot of it's just self-reliance or just trying to spread the relief out as far as they can. And many interesting stories start to come out, and you start to understand the relationships in the community. This would be I'll show you a couple of typical middle class. So you see a lot more pink bonding ties, some somewhat close ties, and then and then actually less of the green ties, right? They would have less of NGO support than, and I'll explore reasons and stuff later as to why these are the dynamics. And then there's people that are close to them but could not provide assistance because they were also equally devastated, or relationships changed after Yolanda. So that's one of the things that's been interesting. Yeah.
How did you differentiate the classes, lower, middle,
Yeah.
upper class?
So based on income, based on profession, education, and type of house. Yeah. So I got that off Jonathan Un. He has in his book Poverty of Television. He had compiled a breakdown from other Filipino studies. Yeah. But I can share with you. And yeah, class is complicated. And one of the things that I wanted to focus on, the middle class and the lower class, not upper class, because in the Philippines, in the upper class, they're really in gated communities that are guarded by dogs. So first, it's really difficult to talk to them. But second of all, their vulnerability to disasters is just not the same. So it would be very difficult to compare. And I thought middle class is more interesting because in the Philippines, the middle class is vulnerable to a disaster dropping them from middle class to lower class. they could be devastated. They could be harmed, or their house could be destroyed, or their profession or their livelihood could be affected or delayed. So in these things, we drop them from a middle class to a lower class. So I thought that was more interesting to look at than just comparing people that might be in the upper class that might be too far away from people in the lower class. So here's another one that's more typical middle class. You start to see similar patterns emerge, right? Lots of pink ties, not so many green ties, some yellow ties. So these would be the more like standard examples. Then things start to get interesting. So this individual, very kind. She was a very kind lady, and she had a really nice house, a really nice concrete house, and she helped a lot of people. So everybody on the outside, you see here, she provided help to them, not the other way around. She was a really good entrepreneur. Her livelihood didn't really stop. I think it stopped for a month. She was very interesting because before Yolanda came, she knew it was going to be a disaster. So she has a small sorry store, right, like convenience store. And she actually went and bought extra rice and bought extra food, thinking that she was going to be able to sell it later at a higher price. Like, smart business strategy, right? But of course, Yolanda was so much stronger than they could have predicted that she ended up evacuating people to her house. So she said 300 people evacuated to her house. So her house was probably like about this size and 2 stories. And all the rice that she had bought previously to try to sell, she had to give away to people. And her brother actually won an award because he had saved 100 people, evacuating them to his house, like mainly children. So this is an example of someone who's a middle class, who is just extremely generous. However, you'll see that on the left side, there's all these green ties, and those are the linking ties that she wasn't able to access. So she knows them, but for some reason, she wasn't actually able to get resources from them. Yeah. And here's just more examples, and you'll see that there's the stars for the migrants, and there are many. Okay, so I think and here, again, another example of even though you know the officials, you can't access goods from them. And there could be a variety of reasons, politics within the community, or really strict guidelines from the NGOs. So just having linking ties is not enough. So I'll start analyzing, go into some of the data that I analyzed. Or some of the questions, I guess, we can start discussing. Because one of the big things I found, it's a question that many people ask, which is, what is recovery? So when I was doing this, a big question that kept popping up was, how do I define recovery in a way that engages with the literature, but also is understandable to the local community? So when I did my interviews or when I did my surveys, I asked people how they define recovery. And many of them would define it as back to pre-disaster conditions. Whereas this definition is seen as old, right? In the literature, this is seen as dated, right? This was a definition used 10, 20 years ago. So since then, they moved on, mainly based on more normative ideas of how disasters or how recovery should be. So for example, build back better. The idea that disasters present an opportunity to not just build back to the same vulnerability in the same position as before, so you're equally or more vulnerable to the next disaster. It's an opportunity to use stronger materials, stronger structures, and to build back better. And then from my observations, it's more like build back higher and build back better. So build back higher in the sense that some people do from the disaster, their lesson learned is that I need a second floor, right? I need to be able to escape the water when it comes. So they will take the extra materials that they have and they'll try to build a second floor. However, it won't be structurally sound, right? It would just be the leftover GI sheets or lumber that they can scrap. And sometimes the second floor is just made of tarps and like old rice bags. But the idea is that they wanted a higher ground. So they got part of the concepts of trying to build back better, but not necessarily all of it, right? So then they get this half attempt. But the difficult part is that actually makes themselves and the community members, their neighbors, more vulnerable. Because when the next big typhoon comes, this is what's going to topple over more easily, crush your own house and those in it, or harm those who are near you, because many people died because the GI sheets and the lumber that flew off of these houses killed them, not necessarily just because of drowning, or a combination of both. So building back higher without these kind of standards or a wider knowledge of risk and could actually be more dangerous. And then build back better in the sense that there were lots of conflicts and tensions with relief, and friends became enemies, and I'll get into a bit later, but there's that aspect, and a lot of resentment with how distribution took place. So yeah, so that's one of the questions we talk about now or later, but how do you define recovery in a way that the local people understand, but you can still engage with the literature that seems to have moved in a more normative direction further away.
What about the sample that you have? Did you all have property or property of the land, use of the land? They were leasing the land?
Yep, so a lot of the middle class would own the land. They would own the lot and they would own the house. Sometimes they would own the house and not the lot, because land rights and property rights is very complicated in the Philippines. And the lower class would rent, or they might be in squatter areas. Yeah.
And how's the reconstruction happens in those who are squatting?
In the worst areas?
Yes, in those who are squatting, who are not having the rights.
So it was very complicated for a lot of NGOs to work in this situation, because they have to both be able to provide these poor people with housing, but not be in conflict with the city or the local government or the landowners, because these people hadn't been paying their rent for a long time. So a lot of them have to go through the difficulty of first finding the landowner and then negotiating contracts with them. So then the NGO would pay for the land. And then there's different programs. So sometimes the households would rent and pay us monthly it's like rent to own, right? And others would have their land is paid for 5 years, and then they have to start paying after 5 years. Yeah, or they're just completely relocated. So the big controversy was the no-build zone, the 40 meters in to prevent from the storm surge. But there's a lot of controversy around that because these are where people's livelihoods are. Because alternatively, they get moved to Tacloban North, which could take up to an hour on a jeepney ride to go up and down to their livelihood. And there's no livelihood up there. It's really rural and it's undeveloped right now. And currently, there's still no water. So the city has to send water trucks up there. And then every 3-4 days, you're allowed to, fill up your couple of jugs. There's electricity, but there's a lot of controversy also around the 40 meters. Why 40 meters? Some people think that it's arbitrary. Some people think that it's to prevent the storm surge. But there are other factors at play that make people vulnerable, not just how close they are to the sea. But land title and all of that was very complicated for a lot of NGOs to negotiate. And that's also why some of the relief was very delayed, which got people very upset. But this is the difficult arena that the different actors have to work in. Did that help you answer the question a bit? Okay. So this is some of the 8 Build Back Safer, Build Back Better key messages that people get told. But again, without the access to the resources or the knowledge of how to actually properly put these in place and the workshops, etc., it's very difficult to follow this, especially when you're not used to it. You've been building your house the way that you build your house for many years, and now you have to build it differently without much help. So I did a breakdown of the definitions of recovery. So this is back to pre-disaster conditions. This is better life or condition. So nobody actually said build back better. In the 507 surveys I did, nobody actually used that term like that. Despite all the advertising, despite all of the flyers and banners that you would see that would say build back better, stronger, together, the term actually doesn't get down to the local level. And nor does really recovery. They don't really use the word recovery either. So they would say, some would say that they want to build a better life than Yolanda. They want to build better conditions. They want to build a better house or a better livelihood. So they use the word better. And then there's a variety of other definitions. So some people would say that recovery is spiritual, It's spiritual recovery. Others would say that it's for example, respondents said that it's when I'm able to put lipstick on again. So for her, it meant that being able to access luxury goods, being able to go back to this, what she used to do, which was more carefree perhaps, or more, she was able to socialize more. But we got very interesting answers to this. But it just shows how diverse the local understanding of recovery is, and how difficult it is to capture, and how removed it is from the more academic definitions of it that we see in the books. Right, so I already talked about one of the questions, so we'll skip this. So my way of trying to go about it is to try to get the respondents to assess the recovery for themselves. So I had a 5-point scale, so 0 was no recovery, 1 to 2 was low recovery, 3 was intermediate, 4 was complete recovery back to pre-disaster state, and then 5 was better recovery. So I did that, and then I'll show you the results. So you see there's the migrant middle class, the non-migrant middle class, the migrant lower class, and the non-migrant lower class. It's interesting that 11% of the migrant middle class said better recovery, because to some of the households, they probably can't get better than what they already have, right? They already have a concrete house, 2-story concrete house, which is really nice. They already have nice tiles and a nice kitchen. So I think it would be difficult for them to get better recovery, especially because many of them did not get assistance from NGOs. So they wouldn't feel like they got that extra stuff that they didn't get before. Whereas the lower class might feel that they have better recovery because they were able to access a completely new home now from one of the NGOs, or they got a new livelihood, or they got capital from the NGOs. And then you see there are a lot of, and this is after 3 years. So there is a lot of self-identified recovered households after 3 years, which is great. And it's very interesting though, because this would be a very different definition or a different assessment if an NGO were to go in by themselves and try to do an independent assessment, just based on, I guess, more rigid indicators of recovery. And the significance of understanding the local perception of recovery is that these households will stop seeking help. They'll stop seeking recovery activities once they feel that they're recovered. And I think that that's an important factor to account for, because their time is money. So instead of trying to chase down NGOs that have stopped calling, that have stopped returning the calls, or that don't have any aid anymore, or trying to ask relatives for assistance, if they feel that they're recovered, then they can pursue other activities as opposed to more specifically recovery-related activities. So there's some of the interesting things I found is about remittance access. So having access to remittances does not necessarily mean you can mobilize that connection to get remittances. So in Lin's conception of the networked theory of social capital, he says that there is an access network and there's a mobilized network. So there's people that you know, right, that you're connected with, but then there's the people you can actually mobilize to get resources from. And the remittances from the people that we spoke to often came, they came just once after Yolanda, and that's because there is a fear of remittance dependence, or they're too shy to ask for assistance, or there's a cultural obligation to return the favor in the future. So an example of the fear of remittance dependence was we had spoken to a respondent, and when we started asking them about any migrants abroad, they started listing siblings in Middle East, a brother in Middle East, 2 sisters in the Middle East. The 2 sisters were domestic helpers, the brother was an engineer. And so then as the interviewers were like, oh great, when we might start hearing a story of financial remittances or how they recovered through that way. So when we started asking, did they provide any assistance? And he looked and he was very sad. He was just like, no. And we're like, oh, because we didn't expect somebody to have 3 OFWs and have 0 remittances. So we said, you didn't get anything, like nothing over the last 3 years? And he said, no. They used to send money to us when our mother was still alive, and our mother would distribute some of it to me, but now that our mother passed away 4 or 5 years ago, they stopped sending remittances. So when we probed them a bit further, they actually said that it's because of the husbands of the 2 sisters and the wife of the brother. So it's actually these bridging ties, these bridging bonding ties there that are providing some, I guess, difficulty in access. And some of it is because of a very concrete fear of remittance dependence, especially for a disaster that affected many people and probably many relatives. So if you are heard giving a certain amount of money to one household, then the other households that are related to you in a similar way might demand or expect the same type of relief. And so that's the other side of remittances that we have to consider, and the limitations that the migrants have, or their feelings towards remittances and their fear of dependence. And very common, we were told that they're just too shy to ask. So people will be able to list like aunts and uncles that were abroad or OFWs, and then when we asked them, did they provide any assistance, they would just say, well, they didn't come forward and we didn't ask. So despite having a relationship, the fact that they did not initiate meant that they didn't, most of the time they didn't ask. And then the cultural obligation to return the favor. Often people would say, well, we can't help them back, or well, what if they ask us for something in the future? We just don't have anything to give back. So they would rather not ask for the assistance and suffer than to try to ask for the assistance and fear for what could happen in the future and those social norms and obligations. Oh, sorry. Okay, so so there you see that the people who did have migrants, 61 middle class had migrants, and 74% got financial assistance, but 26 did not. And then in the lower class, 48% got financial assistance and 52% did not. And these include the one-shot ones. We can skip this, but a little bit of this goes to NGOs. So this is the shelter cluster evaluation form. And you'll see the highlighted question asked about if they get support from abroad or remittances from abroad. And one of the issues is that it's a very ambiguous question, yet people are getting scored on it. You get 5 points or 0 points. But what we found is that a lot of people don't have a clear understanding of what the difference between an OFW is, or a migrant is, or an immigrant is. And they don't have a clear understanding of what would count as remittances or financial support. So very often they might get a Christmas box, or they might get gift cards, or they might get money. But there's so much diversity in how you get support that it seems too arbitrary to just ask, do you get help or not? So actually with one of the NGOs that I spoke with earlier on in the disaster, they did a survey of about a PUROC of 42 people, and 32 of them said that they get help abroad. And then I went back to the same NGO 3 years later and asked them for their data, and that number changed from 32 to 11. It was a different PUROC, but within the same community. So perhaps they figured out that this question was what was causing some people not to get assistance, and they changed their answer, or they taught other people to change their answer. But it just goes to show how complicated it is and how it's difficult just to ask that one question. Okay, so I'll skip to the interesting part, the type of social network. So lower class tend to mainly have bonding and little to no bridging and linking ties, as the sociograms show. And the middle class have mainly bonding and some bridging and linking. However, while some have access to many linking ties, such as all local council, many were not able to mobilize these ties due to other constraints like I briefly discussed. And I think what's my contribution is the idea that migrants are bonding ties that bridge space. So when I talked about earlier, the bonding ties are strong, and they often live in the same geographical area, but that means that they're devastated by the same disaster. Whereas the bridging, if you just have a bridging tie, they can give you access to resources, but a bridging tie alone is not a strong tie. They're more like a stranger. So in a disaster context, to have a bonding tie that bridges space is quite ideal in terms of getting help in a crisis. And I guess it brings the best of the two worlds together. The closeness of a bonding tie, but also the space that allows if you're a bridging tie. And then there's the bonding ties that link. So while linking ties are very significant in a disaster, like I said, many people are not able to access those linking ties. However, if the linking tie is through a family member in a position of power, whether they're in the barangay official or village leader, or they're involved in the NGO or the church, this meant that they could evacuate to Manila for free on one of the military planes, or they could get life-saving medical treatment or access to the relief distribution schedule and resources. So in my analysis of it, I would add these 2 types of ties in addition to the 3, because I found it was too limiting to just try to categorize these ties based on the bonding, bridging, and linking alone. So trying to add bonding ties that bridge space and bonding ties that link would add complexity, but also reflect the reality of what I saw in the field. Okay, so I won't get into these, but basically I started to see that there were some negative stories regarding collective remittances. People would send collective remittances channeled through a relative, and the relative would try to distribute it to the whole community. But then there would be negative repercussions against that relative, because then they're a source of conflict because they can only give the resources to 10 households as opposed to everybody. And then perhaps they might be accused of corruption or being selective. So there are actually some negative implications of having this social capital. I can get into it later. I think I'll skip the Haiyan part. I have some stuff written on it, but I can give that to you later. So in the end, there's some implications for migrant households. So middle class or migrant OFW beneficiary households, they're often negatively impacted. They're negatively impacted by the fact that they have migrants in their community because their neighbors know that they have migrants. So the story I told you about the woman that was very kind and she bought the rice and 300 people evacuated to her house. So a follow-up question I asked her was simply, oh, so you must have great relations in this community. Like everybody must love you. Like your brother saved lives, you evacuated. Like this is great. Like I was getting very excited. And she said, no, actually, because when the relief came, I know that some of my neighbors actually told NGOs not to give me any relief because I had rice and my house was well stocked and my house is concrete. So this ability to have access to the NGOs and this knowledge of their having a migrant can sometimes act to exclude them from relief or exclude them from information. So to a certain extent, this might expose some elements of the dark side of social capital, where certain groups get together and exclude other groups from certain things as a result of their status or a class. And as I said, the existence of a migrant network can negatively impact the households, particularly in instances where the migrant can no longer mobilize those remittances or resources from their migrant, yet they still have a migrant. People still know they have a brother abroad or their son is working. But if their son has their own family and they no longer send remittances, all these details about the relationship might not be communicated to their neighbors or the wider community. So being labeled as being a migrant household can have negative implications during a disaster. So my research is to try to interrogate and look at all those more detailed at a more micro level and to try to contribute to the literature on social capital and disasters and remittances. Okay, I think that's it for now. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Yvonne. Very interesting. Very interesting topic, very interesting methodology. And yeah, a lot of data. I mean, I'm amazed by the amount of information you have.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Is there any question?
When you were talking about remittances,
Yes.
did it include as well remittances from Manila or from other cities, or was it only from overseas?
It was only from overseas, but I do account for the ones that are from Manila and Samar. So they would still count as bonding bridging ties, but when I classify them in terms of migrant non-migrant, it's more focused on transnational, noting that there's just a big difference in the exchange rates and the amount of assistance that they would be able to get.
In your research, it was possible for you to explore to what extent the remittance actually influenced the recovery, so to what percentage or in what proportion that really generates a change or not?
I don't think I was able to get that go there, mainly because it's clear that there are many other factors that come into play. But through the interviews, some people would say that without that assistance at that time, I would not have been able to recover as fast or do this. And that's where timing is really important. So you see, they do say that a lot of the assistance from OFWs or migrants came much earlier on. And that was one of the benefits, so that it came early, but sometimes even if it's just once, the fact that it came early meant that they deemed it as very important. So I don't think I can go to the extent in which they help, because, and also remittances are very difficult to quantify. So a lot of people did tell me the amounts. I do have amounts of how much was sent, etc. But it would be very difficult to really, know that they're giving you the amount. It'd be very difficult to triangulate. So you just have to trust their word on it. But I think you can kind of follow the logic of timing and amount and the details or the information they gave me in the interview to kind of gauge how significant remittances were. Yeah.
It's very, very good.
Thank you.
I like the methodology and method. I'm wondering, as part of procedure and technique of your research, you mentioned about the household and you categorize them. I wonder how much influence this female single household help painting your research. You mentioned about the definition of recovery, where women able to put on makeup.
Yeah.
As part of recovery definition. So I wonder how much influence this single female single household contribute to your research.
So I haven't gotten there yet, because I have to do the data analysis for that. But I think what I did notice, not necessarily because of single-headed households, but more just gender post-disaster, is that a lot of people did see, maybe not a lot, but some people really saw Yolanda as an opportunity to start a new life. They saw it as like a breaking point or a transitioning point. So there were women that, were single-headed households that would marry after Yolanda, because they all of a sudden felt this kind of urge to live and to change the way that they are, because they had faced death. So I have also have colleagues that are looking into the baby boom after disasters. So those kind of things. So there's definitely gender dynamics involved. I just haven't gotten to that with my research, but it will be very interesting to explore. Yeah, thanks for your question.
More questions?
One more.
Yeah.
Did you determine the target community of a certain like NGO or government institutions who gave the support to the community? Because based on your result, you said that the middle class compared to the lower class is more vulnerable, and they are the ones who didn't recover that good. So when you said that one of the respondents told that I didn't receive anything because I'm on the middle class, maybe the target of a contributor would be the lower class.
Yeah, no, that's true. A lot of the NGOs targeted lower class, but there were also, and when I say that, I also just mean like blanket relief. So I guess that statement was more for blanket relief, because there was, I think definitely the first month, it was often everybody got the same thing, because many people were equally devastated. At that time, it would have been very difficult to actually make a clear assessment of who's middle class, who's lower class, who deserves some, who doesn't deserve some, because people were wounded, people lost family members, irrespective of class, and people were hungry, and etc. So a lot of it, in terms of that discrimination, people felt it was based on those issues, is during the blanket kind of relief, and I think even up to 3 months, it was more blanket relief before the NGOs were able to, one, get their team together, right, enough to make the assessments, and then two, create an actual plan in terms of how to assess people. And of course, there's politics involved, because the barangay is also very commonly involved in the selection of beneficiaries and the beneficiary lists. And my respondents often say that the beneficiary list is color-coded based on which party you voted for in the last election. So there's that aspect, those aspects of it as well. And also there's also stories of people who chose just different types of relief. So for example, a respondent told me that the Red Cross had come and allowed people to choose either a block of money to rebuild their house with or a core house. It's the same amount of money, right? But one, you just get a core house, you have to find a lot somewhere. If you can find it, the Red Cross will build a core house there for you, right? Others, they would just get the $50,000 or $80,000, that would have been the equivalent of building the house. So some of the people in her community, or in her neighbors, they chose, maybe 4 or 5 chose the money, and she was the only person that chose a house. Because to her, having a strong house is very important, because previously it was a squatter community. So she knew that, and also labor was very expensive during that time because of inflation. So she was able to look ahead and be like, okay, well, you know, it's the same amount of money. However, for me to go and try to find a contractor, for them to come and build it at a price that is reasonable, in a time that's reasonable, might be a lot of hassle. If the NGO will negotiate all of this, then it might be better. So she had different priorities than her neighbors. But what happened was the neighbors ended up, because the money wasn't technically locked away or put away when they got the money, they started spending it on different things, which is fine, and people do that because they have the different priorities came up. But what happened was, when that respondent eventually left the community and went to her new shiny core house, people got very negative and turned on her, simply because of this kind of disparity in aid, even though it was the same. They had the same choice, but they made a different choice. So she actually said that she doesn't come back to the community very often, because for some reason these other community members feel like they got cheated, because now she's away and she has this new house and life seems really good for her, but things haven't improved for them, and they still live in a similar house that they've rebuilt with materials. So those kind of tensions and with relief exist. Yes.
You speak a lot about NGO assistance in rebuilding.
Mm-hmm.
And I wondered, to what degree did the migrant remittances assist in the rebuild?
I would say a lot. So when we asked them what the money was spent on, a lot of it was put towards the house. So it would be food or the house. And I think but one of the reasons, I think also, not just because it's a priority, but I think the migrants also tend to direct the money towards that way, especially if the house is lived by several households or several, several couples that might live in the same house. So then instead of giving the money and letting it be distributed however, they prefer to give a block of money, and it contributes to the house that houses 4 or 5 people. Then again, it goes back to perhaps less burden on them, or less of the complications of having to explain why you got 5,000, but you got 7,000, and you got 10,000, or those disparities that might exist. But yeah, a lot of it would be put towards rebuilding the house, or the roof, or those things. Yeah.
I'm thinking more on the, because usually in the Philippines, in one area, there's a lot of OFWs.
Yeah.
And they know each other, that
Yeah.
they are already outside, and they have built a network, social network or something, or
Yeah.
a group. And then most of the time, when there's a disaster, they would pool their resources and
Yeah.
give it to one community.
Yeah.
So how did that play? Have you explored that area?
Do you mean within the Philippines or outside, the OFWs outside the Philippines?
Outside the Philippines.
Yes, yes. So I didn't explore that area extensively, because the first couple of trips I went there, I wasn't able to find like too many examples of it. I find that there were examples of it, but it wasn't as prevalent as like the media kind of made it to be. And some of it, I think, is again, I was very surprised, because these are very uplifting stories, right, of people grouping their money together and sending it. And I think that's always very positive. But I think the part that gets difficult is the actual distribution, and the social tensions and issues with the distribution, because the aid is never meant for everybody, and you have to select. And because the households are so close, because the communication is so constant, or even because you share mobile phones, it's very difficult to keep things from people. So you need very clear justifications of why, these family members got the collective remittances and others didn't. Or you would simply have to channel it towards like a school. Yeah. But then if you do that, then your household, like your relatives are like, why aren't you giving money to me?